You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today I'm chatting with Mathilde Caër, a former bookseller and a current staff member at Paris's Music Museum. She's here to discuss the French approach to intellectualism as a universal trait. Culture générale. All right, and welcome, Mathilde. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So can you tell me a little bit about what you do here in Paris?
Okay, yes, of course. I just started a new job this Monday, actually. And it's called, in French, it's called chargé de provenance. And so I'm in charge of tracing back the provenance of the instruments, the music instruments of the Musée de la Musique, Cité de Paris, Philharmonie de Paris, that are not suspected but could potentially have been looted during World War II. So my job is to determine their provenance and try to find out more about who they belong to before they arrive to the museum.
Amazing. Wow. That must be a really interesting and sometimes difficult job, I can imagine.
Yes, because, it's going to be difficult because the archives are missing. And it's, of course, it's a very dark period of history for France. So, yeah, it won't be easy.
Absolutely. But it's essential work.
Yeah.
Now, I've invited you on the podcast today to talk to me about this idea that we have here in France of culture générale, general culture.
Yeah.
And when we talk about general culture, culture générale, that can refer to so many different things. That can be anything from like the Asterix comics to like elements of French history that everyone is expected to know and understand.
Yeah, true.
So when I say culture générale to you, is there anything that immediately comes to mind for you as something that you understand as being part of culture générale?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this topic since you asked me to join the podcast, and I don't think I have one specific answer, but when I think of culture générale, I'm immediately reminded of school for some reason, and our teachers care to make sure that we had culture générale. That's what comes to mind when I think about this term and how important it was for our teachers to ensure that they play their role, their part in giving us what they expected culture générale to be.
Yeah, and I mean, French public school, obviously not everyone in France goes to public school, but a lot of people do, and the French public school system is relatively universalized. So like everybody has a very similar syllabus, so everyone is learning the same sorts of things. So are there certain authors that you would think, like, if you had gone to French school, you definitely would have read, I don't know, Victor Hugo or Maupassant or something like that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's I think the curriculum actually differs from one region to the other, but generally it's the same, but it has different specificities. But yeah, exactly. The writers you mentioned, like Zola or Victor Hugo and Arthur Rimbaud, all men, are sort of expected to be known, or at least to have heard of, when you come out of high school, whether you did science or literature or economics. These are kind of the like the siècle des Lumières or Voltaire or Rousseau, like these kind of 18th century famous figures are what I would say are kind of expected to be at least known to become an adult, I would say.
And yeah, I mean, I think you touched on something really important that maybe some of our listeners don't know, which is that in France, everybody goes to school and stays in sort of a similar system until they're 16, at which point some people might stop and go do an apprenticeship in some sort of trade, and some people are going to choose like a university track that would either be economics, science, or literature. But up until that point of 16, people are going to the same sorts of classes. And so, like you said, they'll be sort of touching on all of these different parts of French culture, be they literature or philosophy or art.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. And there's this idea in France that culture should be accessible to all. And there's that idea, obviously, from a financial standpoint, that, school, since the Third Republic, has to be free and laïque, secular, which we've discussed on the podcast before, and open to everybody. Do you get the impression, working in France's museums, that culture actually is financially accessible to everybody in France?
That's a very loaded question, and and I talked about it, and I guess the answer is different according to whom you are talking about it with, because obviously I won't get the same answers if I speak to people who work in museums, my colleagues who are so educated that, of course, they will say that museums are accessible to all, etc., because they've been living in museums for their entire lives and they've been educating themselves for forever. So of course they'll have a different point of view. In my family, I would say that I was always encouraged. My mom brought me to a museum in Brittany, where I'm from, when I was a teenager. And so I think she's always been supportive of that. She's always encouraged me to read and to go to movies, or to go to the library as often as possible, actually. So I would say that on the surface, yes, I would say that the arts and culture is accessible to all. But I think if you start to dig deeper, you realize that not everyone has access to culture. So I'm not a sociologist, obviously, but I would say that there are a lot of people who go to museums, but there are also a lot of people who like they never go to museums. So
right, like there are definitely steps taken in France. For example, we both live in Paris, and here, like on the first Sunday of every month, museums are free. If you are unemployed, you can show your unemployment, like proof of unemployment, and you can go to museums for free. So there's maybe a desire to make things accessible, but it's a question of whether people actually take advantage, maybe, or know to take advantage of those sorts of, I don't know, accessibility steps, maybe?
yes, it's free under 18, and it's also free from 16 to 25, or if not free, at least really, really high discounts. So I think when I was young and when my friends were young, and I think under 25, you really, really can access to that for free. But it's not always about the money. I would say it's also about your social background, because if your parents are working class, or if they're struggling to make ends meet, and if yeah, it won't be the same access to culture as someone whose parents are teachers, for example. So I guess I would say it depends on your social background, and going to school for free is the general idea that it would kind of even out the inequalities. And I think to a certain degree it does. But yeah, like every system, it has its limits, I would say.
Now, I know that you've spent time working at other museums as well, and specifically the Musée du Quai Branly, which is a museum that sort of looks outside of French general culture into a more international or worldwide French culture, and sort of has works of art from all around the world. Do you get the impression that when we talk about culture générale in France, we're talking specifically about France, or are we talking about the world? Are we talking about France, the hexagon of France, or are we talking about France's former colonial empire? Kind of how do those pieces work together?
I think I would say that general culture is somehow worldwide. Like we're kind of expected to know a little bit about geography, a little bit about politics. I think the French generally would know the name of different presidents.
Like American presidents?
Yes, yes.
And
Oh,
you say a little bit about geography. I think that you're being coy because as an American, you guys know a lot more about geography than we do.
yes, yes, yes. It's true. Yeah, yeah. I would say we're quite good at geography, but that's you mentioned the former colonial empire. It has roots in history because we've been all over around colonizing the world. So of course we know about it because we've been there. So so there's a history to that. And there's a lot of French-speaking countries in the world, which makes it more easier for us as French people to travel around and to know more about different cultures, because if they're in French, they're more accessible to us. So yeah, but if we speak about colonial empire, then it becomes really loaded again and really tricky, because I don't think that France has faced its colonial past yet. So yeah, we know a lot about the world, but when we dig again, there are some history, some stories that we haven't really heard of.
And so much, I think, of what French people are expected to know in terms of general culture, and correct me if I'm wrong, is, writers, philosophers, politicians, but all of whom are French, most of whom are white.
Yes.
And almost all of whom are men.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
French society is a patriarchal society, so of course a lot of attention is brought to on men and white men, and yeah, because it's the patriarchy. Hello.
Sure. Hello.
Hello.
Well, actually, that's a really interesting sort of, I think, maybe distinction for a lot of North Americans. I was reading a chapter of a book by a Canadian journalist, Julie Barlow, who longtime listeners of the podcast will recognize because she was the first guest on our episode about bonjour. And she writes that as opposed to in North America, where the arts are sometimes painted as kind of feminine and therefore lower, in big scare quotes, than interests that are more frequently associated with masculinity, like sports, for example. So like when you're in school and they're cutting budgets, they're more likely to cut art or music classes than they are to cut sports classes. In France, the arts aren't necessarily seen as feminine. Like an interest in literature or an interest in art is not necessarily seen as feminine. Does that ring true to you?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yes, because I don't know. Yeah, we mentioned figures like Victor Hugo or the philosophers of the Lumière, and all of these, of course, were men, and really well-educated men. So we have this idea that we love geniuses, like we love men who are so sensitive, who are really sensitive to humanity, and so we like this figure, and that's what we've learned. So yeah, I would say that the arts are really male dominated in this society, even though it's of course starting to change a little bit. But the historical figures I was taught were all men, and the philosophers I was taught were all men.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Don't Miss This, which will clue you into some of the most interesting events happening in Paris right now. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. In your time working in museums, I know that you don't work in like a guest-facing job, like you're not selling tickets. You're usually in the back office. But I do know that you also used to work as a bookseller.
Yes.
So in your experience in France, either selling books or working in museums, did you get an impression that there was a gender imbalance as to whether more men or women were buying books or coming to museums? Or is it pretty equal?
Actually, I know for a fact that because I know publishers and they tell me that the people who buy books are women. So the people who read are women. It's there's a clear imbalance as regards to that. Readers are women mostly. And it's actually I talked to the Emmanuel Casarero, who is the president of the Musée du Quai Branly, and he also told me that the visitors at the museums, they're all women, and they're highly educated white women mostly. So that information comes from him. So I'm thinking it's really true. Yeah. I think from what I can see when I'm at the museum, I can see that there's more people who are above 40 or 50 who are white and who are, you can tell that they're really well educated because they are looking for very specific information. They want to learn about specific things. So you can tell that their level of education is higher than the rest of France, I would say, because it's Paris, I would say.
So that's super interesting because that's sort of similar to the kind of demographic who's reading and going to museums in North America. And yet I feel like, you never hear, this is such an overgeneralization, but there is this sort of almost emasculization idea of like men, you by and large would not spend a lot of time in the US like being interested in, or it's hard to paint with such a broad brush, but like what I found really interesting in this chapter of the book by Julie Barlow is that like there is this idea that the arts are feminine, and so there's an emasculation linked to it that I feel like even if the people who are generally consuming art in France are women, if you were at like a party and you started talking about, I don't know, Maupassant, and some guy was like, who? Like that would be a judgment on him, not a judgment. Regardless of who's actually reading and who's going to museums, nobody wants to appear as though they aren't aware of artists or writers, even, no matter who they are.
Mm-hmm.
They want to seem aware.
Yes.
In France.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. I don't know if it's, I would say it's the Parisian effect, really, because I don't feel like, well, maybe in big cities, like people are really careful. They make sure they're really cultured, but I guess on the countryside, people are a bit less influenced by the media, or they don't spend as much time maybe indoors, and they prefer to go out. And I'm not sure, but if I compare my life in Brittany and my life in Paris, I would spend more time doing nature things in nature.
Yeah.
Obviously, because it's nature. But in Paris, I would be more inclined to read and to go to the cinema, to enjoy the cultural aspects of the city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, the Parisian effect definitely feels right. And I remember, it reminds me of one of my favorite things that this professor, a Parisian professor, told me, which is that nobody in France ever claims that they are reading Proust. They always say that they are rereading Proust, because no one ever wants to seem as though they haven't read Proust already in France.
That's so ridiculous.
Yeah, it is. But it feels
right. Yeah.
So if you had to imagine like some of the elements, like just thinking off the top of your head of like 5 top elements of like French general culture, I don't know. I'm thinking like, okay, Asterix, Victor Hugo, Proust. Can you think of like sort of the things that you would expect everyone to be familiar with?
Wow. Yeah, Asterix. You're really right. Also, Asterix as a comics, but also the film.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that in most French families, we are kind of expected to know at least 1 or 2 recipes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It doesn't even have to be like French food, but at least to know how to make crêpes, or how to make a bœuf bourguignon, or how to make, what else? At least, I don't know. But I feel like if you're invited to come over for dinner or something, you would take pride in cooking homemade meal. So I guess that's I would say that's part of French culture.
Absolutely. I hadn't even
Yeah.
thought about that. And that's so silly because I'm a food journalist. But
You
yes.
are.
But yeah, food is a huge part of general culture for sure.
Yeah, food and also the place where the food comes from. There's a lot of people who love to talk about different regions of France, les différents terroirs. Like people would love to know if you bring a bottle of wine or if you bring something to eat. They would love to know its history, where it's come from. Is it where yeah, the history around the food, and people they like the stories behind things, objects as well. I would say if you I don't know, there's a lot of interest in l'artisanat, like things made from scratch by hand. Maybe I say that because I work with art curators, so of course they're interested in history of objects, but yeah, un savoir-faire, something that's been done for centuries and gets its values because it's been done for centuries, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
That I would say are important to us.
Amazing. So when you're at a party and someone starts talking about history or politics or the last book they read or museums, like, I mean, I know we're talking mostly in Paris now, but like, is that something that, you know, you're expected to not only know about, but also have an opinion about, would you say?
Yeah, I would
Yeah.
say. Yeah. I think that a lot of French people, they like to talk about the current situation in France, the current social situation, the current political situation. So, yeah, I would say
Yeah.
that people like to talk about what's happening in France mostly as a way to begin conversations.
Right. Rather than, and I know you spent some time like in New Zealand, for example, like, and in a lot of Anglophone cultures, we tend to talk about our jobs or things like that. And in France, maybe there's like less of a tendency to like socially discuss your job and more of a tendency to like socially discuss current affairs.
Yeah, maybe, but I don't know. I know that people with children, they talk about their children, so I don't know if they pay
Sure.
that much attention to current affairs anymore. I say that because I mostly hang out with people who don't have children. So, but people who have children, they'll maybe talk about their children and maybe their job and how they are able to juggle between their house, their job, and their families. That's also a
Mhm.
very important topic of conversation.
Yeah. I don't know. I always get this impression, and like, obviously, correct me if I'm wrong, that there's something a little bit, I don't know if impolite is the wrong word, but like, I get the impression that you're not supposed to talk about your job too much in a social situation in France, and you're supposed to talk about like other more interesting things. But yeah, maybe I'm getting that wrong. I don't know. Coming from America, everyone defines themselves by what they do, and in France, it seems as though they'll sometimes talk about their job, but they also talk about other things.
Yes, you're right. I haven't really noticed that. I don't know. My sisters and I were they talk about their job all the time. So
Okay.
all the time. So I don't know. I
Fair
don't know.
enough. Awesome. Great. Well, Mathilde, I only have one last question for you, and that
Sure.
is, what is your favorite word in French?
Oh, my favorite word. Wow. Je sais pas.
I like to put people on the spot.
J'y ai jamais pensé. I never thought about it. I know my favorite words in English.
Oh, what's your favorite word in English?
I have two. It's shenanigans and and raccoon.
Those are good words.
Yeah. But in French, I don't know. I really like the French language, so I don't know. I don't think I'll be able to pick one word. Maybe amour.
That's a good one.
It's very cliche, but yeah.
No, but it's a lovely one. All right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah.
Where can people find you online? Are you on Instagram, on Twitter?
Yes, I have a bookstagram called my name, Mathilde Caër, and also, I do also have a podcast on Pacific literature. So that's on SoundCloud. It's called Vent d'Océanie, and it's available to all. So yeah.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much for joining me. Have a great day.
Yeah, you too. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.